and today we're going to be discussing managing demand in partnership with the business. And this is based on my experience at the University of Exeter and Gavin's experience at the Parliamentary Digital Service. So a little bit about me. I've been in an IT business partner role for over 5 years, and I've worked at the University of Exeter for over 11 years. I joined the university working in finance services, actually for the business school when I first joined, where I progressed through a number of finance roles and into an IT role as a systems officer, where I was based in the school working with their executive team. The primary focus of that role was working with the executive team to improve business processes across the school and bring in automation using cloud technology. During this time, the university embarked on a professional services transformation, which led to me applying for the IT business partner role, as I wanted to continue the work I originally started with the school, but at a strategic level to help transform the university.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Gavin Berman. I'm the lead digital business partner at the Parliamentary Digital Service. So we're providing the IT and digital services for all members and staff in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So I've been in Parliament for about 20 years and worked out that's longer than 90% of the current MPs. For much of that time, I was working as a statistical researcher in the House of Commons Library Research Service. So that's providing support for members of Parliament to help them get evidence to scrutinise the government or deal with constituents issues. Later moved into a product development role in the same department. So that was promoting innovation and the delivery of service enhancements, operating as that key link with the digital service on tactical delivery and strategic improvements, which sounds familiar. So then 5 years ago, in classic poacher turns gamekeeper, I took the opportunity to join the newly developing business partnering function in the Parliamentary Digital Service that they were setting up, which remains my first and only IT role. What we're going to be doing is talking you through the work that we've been doing in the Parliamentary Digital Service that Jack's been undertaking in the University of Exeter to ensure there's greater partnership in how we manage the demand. So looking at highlighting the case for change, briefly run through our processes, compare our challenges and the impact that the pandemic has had before we finish off by talking about the future plans we have for this. So Jack, if you want to.
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. So the case for change in the University of Exeter actually happened around about 5 years ago initially. So that was around where we kind of created the business partner capability within the institution. So this it's part of a wider professional services transformation where all of the individual colleges had professional services teams within them. And they were centralised into the much smaller core central services. So as part of that, IT was one of the last to restructure. And then Alan came in with a new vision and new structure for the IT service. And that was around being design-led. So that introduced architecture, business partnering capability by creating a new design team. It formalised business analysis capability and information security within the design team. Customer focused, that essentially was around focusing on the customer, so the business, being more responsive and servicing demand. Service centric, this moved us from focusing on systems to focusing on services and measuring service outcomes. This moved us to a design, develop, operate model. So essentially that design team capability was completely new. And our focus really was on building that partnership with the business. So how we started on our journey, first of all, we defined the service portfolio. So this was the kind of service name or the business need. Then we had business outcomes mapped to that, and then business value mapped to that. We defined these at the time as the workspace service, the business and administration service, learning and teaching service, research service, IT security and compliance and governance, help training and advice service, and an external service for external services. We then created governance boards that were chaired by the business to cover each of the service portfolios. Now, I will just say we didn't create a board for each service portfolio. some of them were combined into one board. But it was important to define them individually so that all of the ideas and initiatives could be mapped to that. We then set up an idea capture process to bring those ideas to those relevant boards. This is just a sort of high-level overview of the process. So the process started actually usually with a conversation or initially an email with the IT business partner, where we would go out, sit with the stakeholders, capture those high-level requirements. We would then submit that idea into that service owner board for consideration. Priority ideas from the service owner board were then passed on to BAs to work up more detailed and formalised requirements. This then fed into an outline business case, which was submitted back to that service owner board for consideration to say, yes, we do want this to go forward for funding. This gave the business the opportunity to essentially say, that's not quite there, or we want this merged with something else, or actually, you know, on the face of it, now we've got a bit more detail, this isn't the right time, or it's not something we want to do, and then park it. So the outline business case would then be submitted to the Digital IT Strategy Board for funding, and that was for the design process. As I mentioned, the design capability was quite new, so we had a number of fixed term roles in that department, and we had a kind of contract to bring in contract resource to help support us, and given the demand at the time, we needed a lot of contractor resource, so that was a necessary step. Once the design was completed, the actual design was then used to inform the full business case for full costings, and then allocation of the IT resource into the PMO. The business case would go to the Digital IT Strategy Board to get signed off with that allocated resource mapped, and then into the PMO pipeline. And then it would then go through its PMO processes. So why did we do it this way? It was essentially to, you know, manage partnership in demand with the business. It aligned to our new operating model. How did it evolve? We essentially added a value scoring to it. So this was a weighted score, and it was based on 5 key benefits. So alignment to strategic delivery, financial contribution, payback period, performance, which was around efficiency and effectiveness, and then risk and compliance. So if it helped us achieve some kind of regulatory compliance, for example, GDPR was a big one at the time. And then we also had 2 additional things around complexity. So that was around resource requirements and execution risk. So for example, if it was new technology that we maybe didn't have the skill set within the department to manage, or there were kind of single points of success within the department that had a particularly specialised skill set, that would then obviously bring that scoring down. We also added a senior stakeholder approval requirement because initially ideas could be generated by anyone in the business. And whilst the majority of the time people spoke to their directors of service or the directors of college operations about their initiatives, sometimes those heads of service would essentially not feel that that was an appropriate thing to do at that particular time. So they would put a stop on it. So bringing that in meant that only ideas that were kind of approved and aligned to business plans were going through. Over to you, Gavin.
Thanks very much, Jack. So yeah, we've approached it. We've always had a system for managing demand, but it's not been a very good one, to be perfectly honest. We had a rigid, inflexible cycle. Requests would be submitted at a fixed time every year, at least 6 months in advance of the start of the financial year. And then once agreed, there was no clear process for dealing with and agreeing to any in-year changes, changes in priority, which isn't particularly helpful when you have something like COVID coming along. It was an inconsistent and unstructured process. In some areas, non-existent in the way that demand was collated, and this would be particularly the case for functions who weren't regular requesters or have a great deal of demand. And it was an opaque and uncollaborative. It was unclear what deadlines functions were working to and when they needed to provide information. It was not unknown for a conversation to go along the lines of, well, we've already assessed that request, even though I didn't feel like I'd put a request in. And it was usually the digital Digital's assumption on what a request would be based on the existing functionality that they'd had. And I'm afraid this hasn't been prioritised, so come back next year, even though you had no involvement in the process. So clearly that's not ideal, and something needed to change. And the main drive was from board level discussions where it was agreed there needs to be a change to the system to ensure that the organisation as a whole were giving clear direction in terms of its priorities that were workable for digital. So really pushing that partnership principle. So the key principles coming out of that board work were that any process should be business owned, business led, and the teams themselves were clear about their priorities and how it linked to their business priorities. Similar to what Jack just said, it wasn't unknown for departmental MDs to look at what was being prioritised and say, well, that doesn't align to our key priorities and our strategic priorities. Why are you doing this? And it would turn out someone further down the food chain has put the request in, and there was no clear governance as to what would or wouldn't go onto the list. It was also suggested there should be a single pipeline, so just one way in for demand that's transparent and regularly reviewed. And a key one for us, similar to the bodies that Jack was talking about, the establishment of what we're calling local prioritisation groups. So there was consistent team level collation of demand across the houses through these groups. So the key part of the new process is the establishment of these local prioritisation groups. These are business-led forums. Shouldn't be run by digital. They should be chaired and managed by the functions themselves, not by digital. And this is better in some areas than others. We already had some forums already existing where local discussions were taking place around digital, and where those existed, these have become the local prioritisation groups. In other areas, the departmental management boards have taken on that responsibility, and in some small areas where there isn't a great deal of demand or massive amounts, or large numbers of people there, an individual can take on the role, in effect becoming that local prioritisation group themselves, as long as it was clear who was making that decision. One of the key things is that only demand can come through. Demand can only go into the pipeline if it's come through that local prioritisation group. So as long as people are aware of what that process is, then digital, we're not really that bothered as to how it works. As long as it's clear and understood. The key thing for us, unlike Jack's, where in Exeter they're talking about being aligned to services, we're not that mature in that way at the moment. So we've aligned to the organisational structure, and this is really just a pragmatic decision to enable the local prioritisation groups just to get going, rather than spending a lot of time arguing and defining what the services should actually be and how that would work. It was, okay, we've got this structure, let's just get on and we'll look to evolve as we go along. So in our process, an idea is generated from somewhere within the function and it's submitted to the local prioritisation group. So our process is very much focused on demand management at the moment. So when the demand is known, it doesn't currently include or look at demand shaping or consider how ideas might be solved, or what the best solution would be. So we know what it is we want to do, so let's put it through this group. And so it's then for those local prioritisation groups to evaluate, prioritise the idea and ratifying it with the management boards. So that's a key thing, is just making sure that the executive level are aware of what's being prioritised in their name. And then a request form is submitted. And the form also includes a sort of scoring matrix where weighted scoring along the same. When Jack and I were talking about this, we realised there's more in common than divides us on these things. But our prioritisation scoring was calculated by answering questions related to strategic alignment, situational context. So that's kind of, does it support our digital transformation or reduce tech and cyber debt? How well does it ensure that we're legally compliant or mitigate corporate risks? Looking at benefits and costs. How far into delivery are we? How confident are we in deliverability? So what are the risks associated with delivering or not? And is there a fixed deadline? then the scoring comes in, and we have a ranked list basically of scores based on assumed priority. That goes to our digital prioritization panel, which includes colleagues and functions from digital and from the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and they then make recommendations to our digital strategy board, who have the sign off. What they are presented with are a number of different cuts of what the portfolio might look like if the focus was on dealing with particular issues. So if we wanted a managing risk portfolio, the highest risk scoring projects would be prioritized, or is it about increasing members of the House of Commons and House of Lords satisfaction? Is it low cost? So then it's that they're not necessarily deciding on the ordering of individual projects, but just looking at things more in a whole and taking a view on it that way. So in our looking to evolve, we're looking really at a 6-month review, which will be in around March, where we'll look just to improve and iterate the process, just to see how we can make improvements. So Jack, do you want to just run through some of the key challenges from your side?
What were the kind of key challenges? In terms of Exeter, we did struggle with stakeholder buy-in. So that was around supporting some of the proposed initiatives. Again, as Gavin mentioned already, for some individuals on those boards, they said, oh, this doesn't align to what we want to do, but it aligned to others' business areas. So that was a challenge that needed to be managed. There was also various sort of challenges to the governance process. The business sometimes didn't understand why it was being asked to prioritise things and felt it was something IT should do. The other thing, again, was around the value process. The stakeholders essentially didn't necessarily understand the value scoring, and the value scoring wasn't there to essentially say, for example, oh, it's a score of 40, so it takes priority over everything below that. It was essentially based on the criteria, and then you kind of take a human view of it, and then decide, actually, this does really achieve what we want at the moment, and actually it might be that we need to go off and really work out, is there extra value we haven't surfaced out of this, and then rescore it more appropriately. And likewise, where people had said this is going to do everything right across the board, actually being pragmatic and looking at it again and saying, hang on, this really isn't going to do it, and then adjusting that score down. And again, that's linked in with prioritization. So Gavin, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I've decided just to word my similar challenges just slightly differently to you, but that's pretty much the same in terms of stakeholder buy-in. I think the one I'd focus on is that second one that I've put there. At the moment, there is constrained finances. That's going to mean that we can't deliver all of the things that we would want to, which obviously hampers trust in a new process that you're trying to put in, when really we have a process to add to our backlog of things that we can't afford to do. And so obviously that leads people just to try and look for other solutions and go around the process. But what we've tried to say is, when you've got constrained finances, you need to ensure that the highest priority things or the highest value things are being delivered, and this is a way of us ensuring that. So that was sort of how we tried to get around with that, but there'll always be struggles on that one. I mean, we in terms of COVID, our discussion started before the pandemic hit, but this has really accelerated the new process for us. But Jack, yours was in sort of running for quite a long time. So how did the pandemic affect what you were doing?
Yeah, so because our process was established, it actually paused the process, partly because everybody moved to working off campus. We have an emergency governance process in place across the university that kicks in when there is a major incident. And obviously COVID-19 was a pretty major incident. It moved everyone off-site working remotely. We had research that needed support on site. And we had students that we had a duty of care to look after. So some of them were stuck in accommodation, couldn't go home. And then others kind of went home and were trying to access things from home. So that really did need that emergency governance process. And what that did was essentially pause the kind of strategic long-term planning and move it to a bit more tactically to say, right, what are the key things we need to deliver to make everything work now? I mean, the kind of common one across the sector was getting Microsoft Teams in place, getting things like Zoom in place for universities. That was one we did and delivered very quickly. It was actually already planned in our pipeline. The business case had already gone through a few months earlier, but obviously it hadn't kind of gone right to the top of the kind of pipeline for development, and we accelerated that very quickly.
Yeah, I think most people on the call will probably have some Teams-related deployment story that they can
I think there's a lot of chat going on, gents. So just when you're ready to take questions, please do let us know.
Yeah, so in terms of Exeter, plans for the future, so actually what this has done is this emergency governance has kind of evolved a little bit with some core business response groups. So it moved out of the kind of incident response, if you like, into some more formalised groups around education and around operations, kind of return to campus. What's also happened is the university has launched a new strategy for 2030. And that is now leading to new IT and digital leadership structure being created. We've got a revised ideas initiative capture process coming in. So that's around, again, changing those service portfolios. So at the moment, it's looking like education, research and operations. Then we're bringing in the estates kind of PMO into it, and then the strategic delivery unit, and it's going to be a kind of one-way in approach, which is what Gavin's already done. And then as part of that, there'll be a new governance process.
So I'll just finish up quickly, just say that our process was always viewed as an interim process, as we're just beginning the first of a multi-year digital transformation across Parliament, but what we're doing has always been created in line with those objectives. Shall we leave it there then, and just say over to you to hear about your experiences, questions? I mean, I've assumed you could see all those slides. I've got no idea whether I was just looking at them.
We have shared the slides, a link to the links to the slides as well. So if anybody does want to see those, there's some great material here. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people downloading those. So you've really stirred the pot in the chat here. Hannah Cooper says, sounds great, Jack. This was a little further back, obviously, when you started. Be great if you could note down the value scoring categories, please. So I don't know if we come back to that or whether you want to pick that up as a question now.
Yeah, so the headings of that are actually in the notes in the PowerPoint slide. If you want a little bit more detail, then drop me an email. My contact details are on the slide deck.
Great. Jeremy Burns says, any value checks on improving uni reputation, league table ranking or student experience? Hard to measure, but often important to unis. Yeah,
so that was mostly aligned in with the strategic element of that kind of value scoring criteria. Again, as you said, it's quite difficult to measure. If I remember rightly, one of the questions, there's literally one question for IT, and that covers everything in IT support. So it's very much kind of open to interpretation. It's very difficult to single out a single event to say that really improved the score.
Yeah, it's always good to say that you're going to move up the league tables and then it gets measured 4 years later and you've moved up, but there's been a million projects in that time, so you don't know which one actually helped.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jack. So Jag, as opposed to Jack, said ratifying against an already defined strategic plan, as Jeremy B explained earlier, or having a business IT group board is so important, she feels. Might want to expand on that, Jag?
Just something I touched on in the conversation around we get ad hoc demand and we get planned demand. So having business leaders involved in giving us the true priority of what is a finite IT resource to deliver it, that's a real step change. And I think some companies don't like to embark on that kind of change, to actually say, come on, business leaders, business sponsors, you need to be really guiding us, for things that fall out of the bigger strategic portfolio, but perhaps. So it's kind of middle ground capabilities, we're trying to work on. So that was my point, really.
Thanks, Jag. A great recommendation from Greg Lewis Brown as well. The Phoenix Project, excellent book, absolutely excellent. I'm not even a BRM or in IT. Loved that book. Mark Watson, do you handle new urgent work that hasn't been planned for and don't have the resources, people to take it on without something that had previously been prioritised being stopped? Hope I said that right, Mark.
You missed the word. You missed the how at the start of it, Estelle, but other than that, perfect. So I assume that isn't all work new urgent work that hasn't been planned for. I didn't think there was any other sort of work. But I think for us that having this process, it kind of goes back to what Jag was saying just now. It just gives that transparency of, okay, we can do this, but if we do that, we need to stop something else, and let's talk about what that should be. So we have a process. The process enables that. So the sort of quarterly reviews on the digital prioritization panel will look at new things that have come in. How does that score? Does that mean that something new, so something in flight needs to be stopped, which you obviously want to avoid as much as you can. So the process is there to deal with that. Generally, what tends to happen is money is found from somewhere just to cram more in to do more stuff, but we're hoping that we can reduce the number of the unplanned. You're never going to eliminate it completely, but at least having a process will enable us to be able to plan better for what we want to do.
Yeah, I think for us, through the original process, we would have handled it, unless it was really, really urgent, it would have gone through as a chair's action and still followed the process, but would have been prioritised by the IT PMO for delivery. I think post-COVID, that's essentially what we were doing, urgent demand. So it was getting software available to academics to support online teaching, Teams so the business could operate, SharePoint up and running to support that, and OneDrive, and then essentially the kind of things on the ground, like getting laptops out to staff, because some staff still had PCs.
Great, thank you both. Sarah, feel free to open that mic if you want to come on up, but Sarah's written, interested to find out the time it takes you to move ideas from business through to your processes into PMO for delivery, please.
Anything from very quickly to a ridiculously long amount of time. Ideally, in the process, things should move quite through. I think it's not necessarily into delivery, because that will depend on what else is in the pipeline, but I think at least we should be able to move relatively quickly from putting something through the local prioritization group process. So they meet monthly, and then they can get something added to that pipeline so that it can be reviewed on a quarterly basis. But how quickly that gets delivered is, I'll say up for debate, but it's generally a pretty slow process, unfortunately, unless it is an urgent thing, a top priority that needs to get done, when it will move a lot quicker.
Yeah, for us, the service owner boards met quarterly, if I remember rightly, as did the digital and IT strategy board, and they were offset so that you could take something to the service owner board, and then there'd be a small gap where you could turn around any changes and then submit it straight to the other board. So there was alignment in the sort of scheduling of those. But ultimately, because you'd have to make 2 passes at it, and then there need to be some design in that, it was taking probably a minimum of sort of 2 to 3 months, unless you use chair's actions, in which case you could get it through quicker, because you could use a chair's action on both boards, and then it's just the time to kind of do the design, and for those chairs to consider those business cases.
So Mandy says she's interested in how you communicate finance position to the business.
Do you want me to explain what I meant by that? This is basically, we were talking about when you actually get the funding agreed, it may be less than you expected. It was particularly for Gavin, because we are a government organisation. and then the scope that you've got in your plan may be for so much, and then you've got to start prioritising and slicing that work due to how much finance or spending you're allowed. So I was just wondering how you actually close that off with the business and start chopping the work up or reprioritising, and how you communicate that message, because we struggle with that.
So by the time it gets to that stage, we would have had a sort of project board set up, and that would be when those you'd have the project manager discussing it with those sort of senior responsible owner or executive from the, you would hope, a senior sort of business side user. But it's not, I think scope is absolutely the one thing that people just don't seem to hear when you're talking about sort of de-scoping things, and we're not very good at that, to be perfectly honest. Getting people a shared understanding of what the actual scope is. We've fallen into particular problems in one project where there's just no understanding of what had been de-scoped, and things just balloon up. So it gets us into a lot of trouble, Mandy. I've got no sensible answer for that.
You sound the same as us, because we're the same with scope. I think that there's a lack of understanding about all the infrastructure work you have to do in the background to deliver the transformational work that the business are looking for, and if they cut the funding, then that infrastructure work is also affected. So it's just it's a challenge for us. So yeah, seems like it's a common issue. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious that Jeremy W's are working hard in the background there, and I might be stealing his break time. So Jeremy, you'll have to put me in my place if I'm overstepping the mark here.
No, you're fine.
Thank you. Mick Little aimed at Gavin says, how transparent is the prioritisation process for your local groups? What feedback do they receive from the digital prioritisation panel or strategy board? Mick, obviously, shout out if you want to speak.
I'll just start. Mick, on paper, this is the most transparent process in the world. The reality is very different, as you might expect. So I think what we really need to do over the next few months, so this has been started since the summer really, and it is the ideal is that those local prioritisation groups are communicating sort of down and up to those bodies, and it's for those business boards and groups to sort of talk to each other about these things, and that's just not happening at the moment. That's something we really need to improve, and I've had some sort of conversations with chairs of those panels and strategy boards just to generally improve their communication. We've got a real problem where there are very high sort of decision making governance bodies, and they just aren't communicating their decisions and actions and what comes out of it. And if we're going to make this work properly, then we're going to need to improve that, because it is a massive issue that we're yet to resolve, unfortunately.
Thanks, Gavin. That just echoes what I've been experiencing, exactly that. And things at the top level, at the strategy board level, kind of processes change without being communicated out to those people who are supposed to be participating in that process. So yeah, it's good in a way to hear that we're not alone in those struggles. Thanks, Gavin.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you get the same, but I will have people sort of MDs or will sit on some boards, and it seems like as soon as they leave that meeting, they forget that they were even in that meeting making that decision, and when they're in another meeting, put a completely different hat on, which is just frustrating. Trying to get, if we're going to work towards working in partnership, which is going to be a slow journey, but we just need them to sort of act in that way and sort of take responsibility for the decisions that they're making or being made on their behalf.
You've clearly hit a nerve with this presentation, and people are feeling it here, and that's absolutely wonderful. What I will say at this juncture is that either at the end of today with this event, we'll be sharing a link for another meetup on the 3rd of December where we can all get back together. I'm going to, with your patience, skip the other questions that are there at the moment. There will be a networking event at the end, and we are hosting JAG's community cafe breakout rooms as well, where the discussions can continue. But so that we can keep to time, our next presentation is due in 1 minute with Jag and Hannah. It's BRM driving culture change.